Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. We have back with us today Dr. Al Kertz of Anthill LLC. Al's a regular columnist of Feedstuffs, and you can find his most recent columns in our digital editions, as well as in your mailbox as they come in your e-newsletter. Your column for today, Al, is posted there in the chat, so that's what we're going to be talking about. And that topic is the detecting of heat stress in hutch-housed dairy calves. Welcome, Al. Great to see you again.
Good to be back, Sarah. The last time we talked about heat stress in calves and heifers related to what's called the slick gene, and in two locations in Florida and California, which have certainly hot climates, much more humid in Florida. Well, that really leads to another aspect of that, which is that there really is a limited amount of data on heat stress in calves. Yet calves actually can be more susceptible to heat stress than cows, just like human infants have more difficulty maintaining their body temperature, and because calves have much more surface area per unit of body mass than cows do. And so that's an area that we really need to be concerned about. On the other hand, it's sort of like, well, if you're in the northern part of the U.S. or in more temperate or colder climates, that's probably not going to be an issue. Well, this study that we're going to look at shows that's not the case. And one of the ways of looking at that is to study some of the measurements, such as the temperature humidity index we talked about the last time, and respiration rate, rectal temperatures, and performance, dry matter intake or daily gain. The last two are more difficult to do. So, according to the most recent NAHMS survey, that's the National Animal Health Monitoring Survey, that was done in 2014, calf hutches account for about almost 2/3 of all calf housing in the United States. And of that, 25 percentage units was indoors and 38% units outdoors. So that leaves a distinct possibility for heat stress. So this study was done at the University of Wisconsin, and it was to look at some of these various measurements and indicators of heat stress in Holstein dairy calves that were individually housed across a what would be called a more of a continental climate summer. This was done through uh, various measurements: respiration rate, rectal temperature, and skin temperature, and environmental indicators such as airspeed, relative humidity, and multiple different equations for temperature humidity indexes. The study was done from June 14th to August 10th, 2021, and it used 63 female Holstein calves that were on sand bedded polyethylene calf hutches. So, sand bedding is the best to use in hotter weather because it doesn't trap the body temperature like um, straw would in the wintertime, which is when it's better to be using straw. The shade was only provided by the calf hutch, and its rear ventilation was open. So that were the only heat abatement factors in the study. And following 4 quarts of colostrum at birth, calves were fed twice daily 4 liters of pasteurized waste milk and free choice grain and water. Calves began the study on a rolling basis as they were born, and they began at 14 days of age and finished at 42 days of age. Wire paneling restricted the calves outside of the hutch so they could not get in touch with each other. And of course, there are more details in a paper and a reference which is provided in the publication. Now, let's take a look at the first figure. The thing you'll notice that there's considerable day-to-day variability within measurements, and that's not too unusual. The average daily ambient dry bulb minimum temperature was 61 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature humidity index was 60.8. That was on July 8th. Now that's the minimum temperature. The average daily maximum temperature was 81 degrees, almost 82 degrees Fahrenheit, and a THI of 77. And that occurred on June 11th. But as you can see, most of the time, the average daily maximum temperature was above heat stress, especially when you look at temperature humidity index. And then the average THI across the experimental period was 69.3. That's figure 1, as you see at section C. Now that is above the heat stress factor based on the THI calculation. 91% remained above that of 65. So that is a real indicator that these calves in this environment during the period of most of June and early August were heat stressed on average by a considerable amount during the daytime temperatures. Now the nighttime temperatures, of course, drop down as you can see in figure 1C, and then the daily average was only about 20% above the suggested upper critical temperature. So what we call the zone of thermal neutrality for calves runs from about 60 degrees to 70 degrees or 72. So in those cases, that would be heat stressed when they're above about 70 degrees. And of course, the higher the humidity, the more that would factor into it as well. The average THI at the low end was at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, and the average at the upper end was between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And of course, as we said, that would be compounded if you have higher humidity, which is generally higher in the upper Midwest, even during the winter time. The relative humidity and maximum minimum were the inverse of these times. Now, the external and internal airspeed were also highly variable, but they averaged quite low, only like 0.9 or almost 1 meter per second. So that was not a factor. That also means that you can't rely on the wind speed then to cool the hutch, even if the back is open as well. Now, if we look at the second figure, we'll see that we tried to factor out some other variables here. For respiration rate, the break point was about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So as the temperature went above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that would increase the respiration rate, which of course is an indicator of heat stress. The THI break point was 69. Now that's similar to what has been found in cows at 68 or so. But when you look at some of these individual factors, such as the respiration rate, that began rising above a THI uh, of above at let me start over at above 69. The respiration rate raised above the 40 breaths per minute, which was when there wasn't any heat stress. So every increase in a THI unit had a 2 breaths per minute increase in respiration. The breakpoints for rectal temperature were 21 and a half centigrade, or 70, almost 71 Fahrenheit. And then the rectal temperature began rising above a temperature of let's see, about 70 degrees again. So some of the other factors on this graph, there were no breakpoints detected for unshaved skin temperature or shaved skin temperatures within the ambient environmental range in this study. However, the corresponding shaved skin temperatures and shaved skin temperature values relative to the respiration rate and rectal temperature threshold were 82 degrees Fahrenheit and 90 degrees. So the skin temperature was not really as sensitive a measure of heat stress as was the rectal temperature and the respiration rate. So we must also realize that this can vary with the um, type of hutch that is being used. And I won't get into all that. I have actually worked with one company which happened to be the manufacturer of the hutches used in this. But we know that there are going to be some differences in based on the airflow and how much the temperature is inside the hutch based on the outside temperature. Now, I'm also aware that there's been some work done to put individual shades over hutches, which would, of course, lower the temperature within the hutch. But that has not worked out because it's not economical. It takes a lot of labor to put the shades above each one or across a whole group of hutches. And the material that would need to be used also has a significant cost to it. So that has never really materialized, even though there's been some field studies done with that. Now, there's one other study I'll mention, and it's referenced in the article, and that is a very simple approach of propping the rear of the hutch up with a big concrete block. And that actually was fairly effective. This was done in Washington State, which of course has a dry, arid climate in the summer and can get up pretty high. The normal respiration range in that study was 24 to 36 units per minute, and propping up the rear of it reduced it from 58 to 44 units of respirations per minute. So that was effective, and by two uh, respiration rates per minute were increased per 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature. But again, that's another a labor issue. You'd have to have enough blocks on hand. You'd have to have people going by, propping up the rear of the hutches. Then whenever it cools down, you take them out. So I don't think that's a practice that's become very popular, even though it can be somewhat effective. So that kind of concludes the discussion of the study and some other
So,
related studies.
yeah, so I want to encourage anybody who has any questions to certainly put those in the chat there on the side of your screen. If you're joining us through social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, certainly you can just post them right there and they'll come through to us. And again, Dr. Kertz's column on this topic is posted there in your chat. So Dr. Kertz, you mentioned humidity, but there's also, you mentioned temperature in terms of, in the South, it's probably not getting as cool at night. It's not cooling off like you would have in the North. Is that a pretty big factor? Does that help to, um, you know, keep things cooler overall, or there's still pretty much of a concern and that cooling off at night really doesn't factor in all that much?
Well, if we looked at the study we addressed last month, it had measurements in Florida and in
Mhm.
California. And in Florida, it never really cooled off below the temperature heat indicator that was heat stress. So the calves were heat stress throughout the day and night because they
Mhm.
had higher humidity and it didn't cool off. When you went to California, while the temperature could be higher in the day, it would cool off more in the night, and the humidity was lower. So it's that combination that makes it a problem. And as we saw in this particular study, um, there was heat stress during the day, but during the night it cooled off enough that generally there wasn't a problem. And keep in mind that the zone of thermal neutrality for calves is between about 60 degrees to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So in this study, they were cooling off enough at night that they were getting some break there. But yes, the more humid it is with a higher temperature, and the temperature does not go down that much during the night, that creates an ongoing heat stress throughout the day and night. So I know in Missouri, we often get heat stress during the night. The cows don't get to cool off much, not much better off than Florida during the middle of the summer.
So, but that cooling off, that doesn't really still negate the overall concern about the heat stress during the day. It's not enough to kind of offset that, right?
Exactly. What it will do is not add to the problem by not being cooler during the night. So in Florida, it doesn't get enough cool down during the night, so they still have heat stress. Not as bad as during the day, but they still have heat stress. Whereas if you're in other parts of the country where it cools off enough at night because of altitude or the upper latitudes in the US, then that minimizes the time that they're exposed to heat stress. They still have it during the day, but they may not have it during the night.
You also mentioned that perhaps there's a difference in calf hutches and their design in terms of how well, if there's some influence on heat stress on those calves. Are there any without mentioning any names? Are there
Yeah.
any particular features perhaps that dairy producers should look at? Is there certain vents? Is there certain size of the opening? Certain things that hey, we should pay attention to this. It's going to help to minimize that risk of heat stress.
Well, I'm familiar with the typical design, which is more rectangular calf hutch. And the key then is how much opening is there for air circulation? And so on the back end, um, many of those have flaps where maybe as much as a third of the back can be open at the top. And, the hot air rises to the top in a hutch. So the more air movement you get out of the hutch, the less buildup there would be of temperature in the hutch. And sometimes the temperatures can really get high in hutch. I'm aware of some farms that I don't think they're made anymore. They were round hutches and they only had a little simple center opening. And they accumulated heat quite a bit because there wasn't good ventilation to get rid of some of the hotter temperatures during the day.
So let's kind of wrap up here in terms of as we always ask Al. So what is your bottom line in all of this? You've given us some great information. What should we really take away from this?
Well, the chances are, even during the upper Midwest and the Northeast and the Northwest, calves are going to be heat stressed during the summer. And so, whatever you can do to minimize the heat stress during the summer by shade, by air movement, having a good opening in the hutch, or even propping it up at the rear, that will minimize the daytime effect that you have. And then, depending on your local temperature during the night, that could also reduce the time that they're subjected to heat stress. But otherwise, there's not much you can do. Make sure that the calves have hutch, uh, that they have shade, whether it's a hutch or any other way. In Florida, for instance, you'll see some hutches that are actually made out of totally wire. So there's constant air movement, and then it has to have some cover over the top, so you have some shed. some shade, and that's about as good as you can do under conditions like that.
Very good. Well, Al has mentioned a couple times an interview that we did actually just last month in comparing Florida and California and calf and heat stress. That is available in on demand on Feedstuffs 365. So you'll want to check that out as well. Dr. Kertz, thank you so much today for sharing your insight with us. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
We appreciate all of you joining us as well. We know you have a busy schedule, so giving us just a little bit of your day is much appreciated. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on demand at feedstuffs365.com. So you can go view them anytime you like. You can rewatch them. You can share them with your colleagues and friends. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.